There's this interesting thing that I've discovered that scientific evidence seems to suggest that depressed people are more rational. You may think, how does that make sense? Depressed people, someone with a dysfunctional brain is more rational. But then I think about it, and it kind of does make sense because you got to think to what we are as a biological organism. You know, can't look at us as like this, uh, you know, absolute essentialist, agent in like a philosophical type of way. Gotta look at it for what it is, as far as you know, what we've evolved to do as an animal, because we are animals. That's not up for debate. So anyway, it would make sense because how did we survive in the wild? How did we get this far? Right? You would have to have some type of, you know, unfounded, irrational optimism to, facilitate having hope for getting better, for achieving something, for, you know, going out and hunting for food and, you know, exploring new places and, you know, having the motivation to do all those things and think that you're going to survive it and, procreate and, build civilizations and that sort of thing. Like, it takes a pretty decent amount of, almost irrational, like borderline irrational optimism. And when you're depressed, you don't have that level of optimism. So yeah, you may be more rational. But what the interesting part to me is that would seem to suggest that a healthy human is slightly irrational. Like, you would think, if you're just thinking like from a logical, rational skeptic point of view, that, oh, rationality is, you know, of course, the default is to be rational, but evolution and scientific evidence would seem to disagree with that. As far as humans, we can't just assume that human beings are inherently rational actors, because we're not, obviously. You know, due to all these, our brains aren't really intuitively wired for rational thinking. We're just, pretty prone to, fallacious reasoning and cognitive biases. But it's pretty interesting because if you look at it from like, this is just my speculation, my own head canon. But I'm thinking like the mechanism of action is probably something to do with dopaminergic signaling. Um, when you're depressed, you have that dysregulation of dopaminergic signaling. Um, you know, Dopamine is looked at as the feel good hormone, or the feel good, I'm sorry, not hormone, but feel good neurotransmitter, the feel good chemical. But it's actually, I would say it's probably a misnomer. That's probably a not accurate description of it. I'd say probably it's more associated with being the motivation neurotransmitter, motivation to do things that feel good. Like, feel good, that'd be more like the opioid. But anyway, dopaminergic signaling. When you look at on the hormone side, uh, I would say probably testosterone, because testosterone functions it modulates dopaminergic signaling. You think of, oh, testosterone, dopamine. You think of like risk taking and confidence and, you know, drive, motivation, that sort of thing. And like, and that kind of goes with what I was saying. That irrational, you know, not necessarily irrational, but kind of slightly, in the slightly more uh, glass half full type of thinking. You just confident. You're looking at it like risk taking. Like, what is risk taking? You're thinking you have this kind of glass half full type of thinking that, even though these odds are not in my favor, I'm gonna take that risk. I'm gonna still do this thing, thinking, having the hope that you're gonna actually succeed. Like, you would, in certain circumstances, you would say like, hey, that's kind of a bit irrational. If the depressed person said, that's irrational, they probably would be correct technically. But just because they are more rational or tend to be more rational doesn't mean that that's necessarily a healthy human. So that's a pretty interesting concept. Um, yeah. I mean, it really kind of makes sense if you think about it, because, you take a depressed person and, generally, they have symptoms of, something like the lack of a will to live. If you think about it, what is a will to live? Like, what does that even mean? What is a will to live? If you break it down, it's like a hope, like you're hoping for something better, or you're striving towards something. Like you're regardless of like your current situation, you have some sort of prospect that it can potentially get better, or at least not get worse, I guess. Probably get better, but anyway, if you think about it, that's kind of, a bit unfounded. Like, it's kind of unfounded. It's kind of, you know, like, you could kind of say that's irrational to a degree. If you think about it, like we were saying with the dopaminergic signaling and how testosterone modulates the dopaminergic signaling. And if you take a person or a male with low testosterone, they, report, weakness, uh, loss of libido, or, you know, less drive, less motivation, less energy, you know, just depression, that sort of thing. You can give them some testosterone, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, they have more energy and, more drive, motivation, will to live. They want to, achieve their goals, that sort of thing. And put two and two together, it kind of makes sense. That dopaminergic signaling in a healthy human kind of puts you in a more optimistic, goal-oriented mindset, which may or may not be, you know, tilted more towards being irrational. But it's actually more healthier to be in that state than being in a depressed state. But the depressed state is more rational. Man, it's an interesting concept. Now, am I telling you to go shoot testosterone? No, of course not. I'm not a doctor, and this isn't medical advice. This is strictly for informational, entertainment purposes only. I'm just sharing my opinions of, things that my interpretations of, you know, things that I've learned. But of course, always do your research, your own research. But I think it was just interesting that that concept, it just kind of further goes to elucidate the point that humans aren't inherently rational actors. Like we aren't necessarily evolved to be logical thinkers and you know rational actors. We kind of just we evolved to do what we've been doing in the wild for several 100,000 years, and that's kind of it worked, and that's why we're here. But as far as being rational and being scientific minded, we kind of have to you know teach ourselves that, because it isn't intuitive. Intuition only works for well, it barely works for those things, but it's kind of just for the common thing. You hear some noise, some rustling of a bush. Oh, maybe there's a lion or a tiger or some kind of animal behind it. Run, because if you don't, you probably get eaten. You know, but then it doesn't even work for a thing as simple as that, because you can hear some rustling behind a dumpster, and you think it's a bad guy trying to. But then intuition doesn't even work for something as simple as that, because you can hear some rustling behind a dumpster and think it's a bad guy coming to attack you, but it's really just a plastic bag. So to say that, to even allude to the notion that you know to use so it's pretty silly to even allude to the notion that to solve complex problems that we should just rely on human intuition, a gut feeling. That's not a reliable path to truth. And it demonstrates itself time and time again, even on the most simplest common thing. you know so but this is the good thing about that. If science, rationality, rational skepticism, logic, reason, that whole entire thing, if those things are not necessarily intuitive, if they're counterintuitive and they're reliable, that means they can be taught. Because people even allude to this like colloquially, like, oh man, he just has that it factor. Oh, he just has that killer instinct. That's it. So basically they're implying that you can't learn it. It's just kind of innately in you. That would be intuition. But science and it's the opposite of that. You actually can learn it, even if you didn't know it before. It's not just some inherent, innate thing that we just kind of rely on, natural talent, or, oh, this guy just happens to have some type of genetic advantage or whatever. And so, it's intuition, which is, unreliable, versus, skepticism, which is, scientific skepticism, which is methods that can be taught, that repeatedly and reliably and demonstrably continue to prove themselves as reliable. They worked. But anyway, another point that I almost forgot, but I think it's pretty important that the depressive ideation, they're egocentric. So there's this concept in psychology. There's egocentric, ego-dystonic. Basically, just to kind of paraphrase and sum it up, egocentric means that it agrees with your idea of yourself, and ego-dystonic means it disagrees with your idea of yourself. But anyway, the depressive ideation, it is egocentric. So you'll be depressed and you'll have these feelings and these, say certain things, and you'll think, well, yeah, I'm just being rational and that's just my personality. But the depression, when the depression is relieved or cured, they no longer have that same ideation, and whatever their new outlook on life is also egocentric. So what is the difference there? All right, so nothing, they literally have the same life, right? Everything's the same except for those chemicals in their brain, which has something to do with dopaminergic signaling, I'm assuming, that's causing them to have a different outlook. But it's the same, they're both egocentric. That's the thing. So just because you think that, oh, I'm being rational, this is just who I am, that doesn't mean that that you don't have some sort of pathology. Or so just because your ideations and your self-image isn't ego-dystonic, just because it's egocentric doesn't mean that you're healthy. Because, like, as we elucidated earlier, that depressive people with symptoms of depression, they tend to be more rational. Doesn't mean they're healthy, because there may be this instance of post hoc rationalization. Basically, they come to a conclusion irrationally or unfounded, and then try to rationalize it with logic after the fact, even though that's not actually the method that they use to get to that conclusion. So anyway, the takeaway from this summary is that the baseline human ideation, or a baseline healthy human, is actually not, stone cold rational, but actually more a bit tilted in the more optimistic glass half full direction, which is, it makes sense once you think about how we evolved, and what being 100% logic machine, 100% rational as an ideation, and how that would, if you take that and put it in historical, in prehistoric times, how that would play out, probably wouldn't be as favorable as far as survivability. But makes sense. Depressive people tend to be more rational, but that doesn't mean that they're healthy, and that suggests that healthy people are slightly tilted in a more optimistic direction. Pretty interesting concept.